Hello, class, and welcome back to your introductory lectures. This is part 3, the significance of film form. And here in our first slide is a still from Todd Haynes' film Carol from 2015 about a romance between these two characters here and the forbidden nature of it in the time in which they lived in the 1950s. And not only is it an excellent film, but it is also a very excellent example of mise-en-scène and cinematography. So if you're looking for a film perhaps to write about, when you choose films to write about, here's one example. And I'll give you some examples throughout of films that I think are worthy of study. Okay, so we talked a little bit about form in the last lecture, and we said that form is essentially the tools with which the filmmaker tells its story, right? The tools that the artist uses. So with a painter, the form is not only the canvas, but the paint, the kind of paint that's being used, right? Whether it's water or oil or some other medium. It's the brush, the kind of brush. All that stuff is form. And it's also the methods that the painter brings that he or she has learned. Content, meanwhile, is the painting itself, right? It's what the art is about, whether it's a novel, a painting, a film, an opera, or a song. And the two are inextricable, right? You can't have one without the other because form shapes the meaning of content. While content gives form its purpose. So a few more words about content. So again, it's pretty straightforward. The content of a film is its story. And if we're talking about narrative film in this class, which we are, that's the content. It's everything inside that film that unfolds as you watch it. And it's important as we learn how films are made, to start thinking about why films are made, right? And it's important to recognize that films are not created in a vacuum. They're created by people, and therefore reflect all of our biases, right? They're historical. That means that they exist in a historical moment. They're subjective. They're from one point of view, and they're political because we are political. We all have political values, whether we think we do or not. So people can only tell stories from their experience and perspective, and a lot of times you'll have people trying to argue that certain art exists outside of history, right? That it has a universal meaning for all people, for all times. You often hear people say that about Shakespeare, but that's dangerous because then we don't understand context. So, for example, there's been a lot of debate in the media lately about whether or not certain films or books should be allowed into the culture anymore, like Dr. Seuss. Should we, read Dr. Seuss's books if they contain caricatures or stereotypes of different racial groups? Should we watch Gone with the Wind, right? If it contains damaging stereotypes. I can't tell you whether or not you should watch or read those things, and I never would presume to. What I can tell you we need to do is to understand them in their context. And so Turner Classic Movies, for example, did what I thought was a good idea with Gone with the Wind, where they're not going to not show it because it's important to cinematic history, but they are going to try to contextualize it by putting a little, short, not a disclaimer really, but sort of an explanation of why some people find Gone with the Wind problematic, what the prevailing attitudes were at the time that the film was made in 1939, where our society was still very racist, and certainly during the Civil War, when the film was set, when slavery still existed. So that's what we're going to try to do. we're going to try to contextualize our content so that we understand it in a more sophisticated way. We talked about the elements of film form. We're not going to go over this again until we get to the individual lessons, but just quickly, narrative structure, mise-en-scène, cinematography, editing, and sound. These are the tools of film, techniques that are used to tell the story in the movie. Here's Ang Lee, who's a Taiwanese director who's made a lot of different kinds of films, such as Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, The Life of Pi, The Ice Storm. He's really very, in terms of the content that he explores, very diverse. Sorry about that. The sheer amount of work that goes into these movies, and the sheer number of choices, because every film that you see could be telling the same basic story in a very different way. And then form is pattern. This is important, right? Because artists design their work so that we can have a structured experience. Films coax us to connect sequences into a larger whole. Even small details are linked in a pattern. Nothing is random. How could it be? It takes too long to make a film, and they're too expensive, and there's too much on the line in terms of turning a profit, right? To let them be random. And so a style is created so that we can have a structured experience. And we're going to talk a lot about how that structure works in the different lessons. So just one quick example, in The Sixth Sense, spoiler, feel free to move forward if you haven't seen The Sixth Sense and you don't want a spoiler. But for those who have seen it, when you first watch The Sixth Sense, it unfolds, at least it did for me when I first saw it in 1999, it unfolded in a way that was very surprising. Right? I didn't know that Bruce Willis' character was dead. But what happens was that M. Night Shyamalan, who directed the film and wrote it, he put the color red into the frame every time there was a ghost. So that cued us in subconsciously to the fact that Bruce Willis' character was a ghost. Now, did we recognize that upon the first time seeing it? No. But it creates these subconscious patterns, these stylistic patterns in our brain that we're trying to work out. And it allows us to engage the story in a more cohesive way. And then we go back and watch it, and we can appreciate, oh, wow, that was really sophisticated, that was really subtle, right? Formal expectations. We all have many, many expectations going into films and TV and all the media that we consume. That's part of why so much of it is so similar, right? Why every Marvel film plays similarly, why every Bond film plays similarly, because audiences want it to. They expect it to. They've discovered that they take pleasure from it, and even though they want it to be a little bit different each time so they're not bored, they essentially want the same things. And so expectations are central to our experience of all art. And we enter into an active participation with art, creating and readjusting expectations as the pattern adjusts over time. Filmmakers often subvert expectations and conventions, especially within familiar genres, right? So in Skyfall, for example, there's a throwaway line when Bond basically confesses to having a relationship with a man. Now, that would never fly in the 1960s, 70s, or 80s, right? Probably not even the 90s. But our expectations of Bond is that he evolves with the culture, right? And so you see these subtle differences that reflect the culture. Form and feeling. Feeling is at the center of all movies. Movies are not intellectual experiences. We can intellectualize them. We can go back and we can look at how they're made, and we can admire that. But in the moment, they're grabbing us, right? That's why we love them. Or television, or video games. which uses a lot of the same formal elements as film. Form shapes and often subverts the spectator's emotional response. We know this. The shark motif in John Williams' score for Jaws being one of the most famous elements of form that creates emotion in us, because especially for people that are first seeing the film, and especially when it first came out, before it became really famous, when that dun-dun-dun famous refrain came on, people's stomach tightened, right? The fear started to well in them. Like, that emotional response was created expertly by the filmmakers. So form is meant to create feeling. And the emotions represented in artwork are often meant to differentiate from emotions felt by a spectator, right? We might witness a character who's incredibly violent and angry, but what we're feeling is sadness, because we know that that character is trying to get revenge because someone killed his family or whatever it is, right? So there's this disconnect that informs our experience as well, emotionally. And here's an example from The Silence of the Lambs in terms of the relationship between form and feeling. So if we look at the top still, this is when Clarice first meets Hannibal. She doesn't know him yet. She doesn't know what to expect, right? She's keeping her distance. And so Jonathan Demme, the director, he gives us a basic two-shot of Hannibal and Clarice. It's a straight-on shot, right? They're keeping their distance in the frame. They're at the edges of the frame. And later, by the end of the scene, they've already formed an emotional bond. And so the director changes the shots, right? Now it's a low-angle shot looking up at them, which gives us a sense of intimacy. Now they're closer together in the frame, right? Now they're medium shots instead of medium-long shots so that we can be closer to their faces. So all of these formal choices that are made by the director, and some that we can't see here, such as music, right, are being used to create emotion and to evolve our emotional experience throughout the film. It's very important for us to understand, not only as film students, but also as filmmakers. And movies convey meaning. We know this too, and I think a lot of people don't think about meaning very much. They don't want to. They think of movies and television and video games as escapism, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's the great thing about art. You can take whatever you want from it. But there is meant to be meaning, right? And so part of our job as a student of film is to try to understand the meaning. Referential meaning establishes a film's subject. Basically, we understand American Snipers about war when we watch it because we know what war is. Like, we know there was an Iraq war. Like, we saw the news, right? So it's basically referring to a real life experience. There's an explicit meaning through context. What's the explicit meaning of American Sniper? Well, it's basically about a guy who goes to war and kills a lot of enemy, right? What's the implicit meaning? Well, that is up to the viewer. Clint Eastwood is a very political filmmaker. Some of his films can be read as very liberal, and some of his films can be read as very conservative. So how do you read American Sniper? Is it a criticism of American warmongering? Or is it meant to be admiring of a warrior like the one played by Bradley Cooper, who goes and does the dirty work that people back home don't want to protect them, right? And so when you think about making arguments about film, you think about people could take a very, very different meaning from one film. So how are you going to convince your friend or whoever that your meaning is the one that most represents the film? Well, you do it by giving them evidence. You say, well, look at this scene here. It's clear by the way this is set up, how it's written, acted, photographed, the way that it creates emotion, the way that it refers to events in the real world, that Eastwood is criticizing our involvement in Iraq. And there's not, and that's the thing, you know, everybody in our society is so keen on, you know, especially in the age of you know, online forums and social media. Everybody's so keen on their opinion being the right one. And when it comes to art, we just have to kind of get past that. Like, the meaning always lies in the viewer, the individual viewer. So we talked about this. I don't want to go too much more into this. The function of each of the elements. We talked about the function of the elements in the Silence of the Lambs example. Similarity and repetition, right? Patterns. Like in a song, you would get a chorus, right? You get a couple of verses and you get a chorus. The similarity and repetition creates a structure that we respond to. For example, the motif of the shark in Jaws, or the motif of Red, The Sixth Sense. Difference and variation we talked about, right? We want the Marvel films to more or less be the same, but we want enough difference and variation so that we're not bored, so that gives us something new each time. And then the development, the progression of films, and the progression of genres, and the progression of film franchises, like we talked about with Bond. There always needs to be developing. Okay. And that is the end of this lesson. And here's another really good movie that you might enjoy watching and writing about, called Little Woods, directed by Nia DaCosta. It's a very political film. It's about these two sisters who live in kind of in the middle of nowhere in North Dakota, and there's a lot in there about poverty and access to medical care, and some of the main issues in our society today. So it might be interesting to watch it and see if you can figure out for yourself what the movie is saying about those subjects. All right, and then the next lesson, we will start looking at story structure.